Somewhere inside the grounds of Windsor Great Park, behind iron gates that have not fully opened to the public in years, sits a 30-room mansion. Royal Lodge, Grade 2 listed, sprawling gardens, a property with a rateable value that would make most people's eyes water. And inside it, refusing to leave, is a man the king has stripped of his military titles, his royal patronages, his HRH working status, and every last shred of his public role. A man whose name, since 2019, has become synonymous with one of the most damaging scandals in the entire history of the modern British monarchy. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, the King's own brother. And here is what nobody in the mainstream press is saying clearly enough. King Charles III, the sovereign, the head of state, the man whose face will appear on every banknote in your wallet, cannot remove his own brother from a house the crown owns. He has tried. He has applied pressure through every quiet institutional channel available to him. And Andrew has looked at all of it, looked at the full weight of the British monarchy bearing down on him, and said no. Not privately, not diplomatically, not through carefully worded legal letters exchanged behind closed doors in some Mayfair solicitor's office. No. And what has unfolded across 2024 and into 2025 is a standoff so extraordinary, so deeply revealing of the dysfunction rotting at the very heart of the House of Windsor, that palace insiders, people who have spent their careers navigating royal politics with the careful language of trained diplomats, have described it in terms that would be remarkable if they appeared in a work of fiction. Tonight, we go inside that standoff. We follow the money, the leverage, the legal architecture, and the psychology of a man who has lost everything except the one thing he refuses to surrender. And we explain what King Charles is doing about it, and why, so far, it has not been enough. But before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, now is the time to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Because what we do here is not royal gossip. It is not palace PR dressed up as journalism. It is forensic commentary on the institution that Britain still refuses to scrutinise honestly. We go where the mainstream coverage does not. And this story, this particular story, is one that the palace desperately does not want told in the way we are about to tell it. So subscribe now, and let us begin. To understand the Royal Lodge standoff, you must first understand what Andrew lost. Because the magnitude of what was taken from him is the only thing that explains the ferocity with which he is clinging to what remains. Cast your mind back to November 2019. Andrew sits down for what is, by any serious assessment, one of the most catastrophically misjudged television interviews in the history of British public life. He sits across from Emily Maitlis on BBC Newsnight and discusses his friendship with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. He does not express sympathy for Epstein's victims. He does not apologise. He does not demonstrate even a performative flicker of remorse for the associations that had already begun to define his legacy. Instead, he provides explanations. About a Pizza Express in Woking. About a medical condition that he claims prevented him from sweating. Explanations that, within hours of broadcast, became international shorthand for the kind of aristocratic detachment from ordinary reality that republicanism is built upon. The fallout is immediate. Andrew steps back from public duties within days of the interview airing. His office releases a statement. The palace releases a statement. Everyone releases statements. And yet, as is so often the case with the British establishment, the statements say a great deal while committing to very little. Then, in January 2022, Virginia Giuffre's civil lawsuit in the United States, which alleged that Andrew had sexually abused her when she was a 17-year-old minor as part of the wider network of exploitation facilitated by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, reached its conclusion. Not in a courtroom, not with a verdict, not with the kind of public accountability that Giuffre's legal team and victim advocacy groups had demanded. Instead, the case is settled out of court. Andrew pays. He admits nothing. The terms are confidential. But the settlement, combined with a Newsnight catastrophe, makes one thing politically and institutionally impossible. Andrew cannot return to public royal life. The palace knows it. Charles knows it. And crucially, the palace makes it official. In a single statement from Buckingham Palace, Andrew's military affiliations are returned to the crown. His royal patronages are transferred. He will no longer use the title His Royal Highness in any official capacity. He is not expelled from the family. But he is expelled from everything the family represents in public. He is erased from the working monarchy in the most complete way the institution knows how to achieve without a formal act of parliament. Andrew retreats to Royal Lodge, and this retreat, this withdrawal into the 30-room Windsor Grace and Favour mansion he has called home since 2003, is where the story of 2024 truly begins. Because Andrew, stripped of his titles, his patronages, his public purpose, and his reputation, has made a decision. A decision that tells you everything you need to know about who Prince Andrew is and who he has always been. He has decided that the one thing he will not surrender, the single front on which he will not retreat, is the house. The house is the line. And to understand why, you need to understand what Royal Lodge represents. Not just architecturally, not just financially, but psychologically, symbolically, institutionally. Royal Lodge is not simply a large house in Windsor Great Park. It is a declaration of belonging. It is a geographic statement that Andrew is still inside the world that made him, still within the boundaries of the estate where the monarch lives and works, still, in some tangible, physical sense, part of the apparatus of the crown. As long as Andrew wakes up inside those gates, as long as he rides his horses across those grounds, as long as his address places him within the Windsor estate, he cannot be described, even by the most hostile commentator, as definitively expelled from royal life. He is diminished. He is disgraced. He is stripped of almost everything that defined his 4 decades as a working senior royal. But he is still there. And that stubborn, defiant, immovable presence is what the palace finds intolerable, and what Andrew finds essential. Now let us talk about how Charles attempted to solve this problem, because the approach the palace chose reveals something important about the limits of royal power when it collides with a determined opponent who has nothing left to lose. The palace's playbook for removing unwanted royals from grace and favour properties was established in early 2023, when Harry and Meghan were formally asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor estate. It is worth examining that eviction carefully, because the palace clearly expected the same model to work with Andrew. Harry and Meghan complied with the Frogmore request. They had little practical choice. Frogmore Cottage is a significantly smaller property than Royal Lodge. Their connection to the Windsor estate had already been severed by their very public exit from working royal life, and fighting the eviction would have looked, given the backdrop of their California life and their Netflix deal and their memoir, extraordinarily petty. The palace looked at that outcome and made a calculation. If it worked for Harry and Meghan, people with global platforms, American lawyers, and a stated willingness to challenge the institution, it would work for Andrew. Andrew was weaker. Andrew was more isolated. Andrew had no sympathetic public narrative to deploy, no Oprah interview in his back pocket, no army of supporters in the media willing to frame his fight as heroic resistance. Charles's office began applying pressure over Royal Lodge throughout 2023. The Crown Estate, which manages the properties on behalf of the sovereign, made clear that the lease arrangements were under review. There were reports, consistently sourced across multiple royal correspondence, that Charles wanted Andrew to relocate to a smaller property on the Windsor estate. Frogmore Cottage, vacated by Harry and Meghan, was reportedly suggested as an alternative. Think about the symbolism of that suggestion for a moment. The palace was asking Andrew, the man who had held a senior royal position for 4 decades, who had served in the Falklands War, who had been the Queen's favourite son, to move into the cottage that had been vacated by the nephew whose departure from the institution Andrew had privately welcomed. It was not simply a property offer. It was a statement of status. a declaration of exactly where the palace now placed Andrew in the hierarchy of the Windsor family. Andrew's response was, by palace standards, extraordinary. He said no. His legal position, as communicated through his representatives, rested on several foundations. He held a long-term lease on Royal Lodge, a lease that had been granted under terms that predated the current reign, and that gave him legal standing that the palace could not simply override by administrative decree. He'd also invested his own money in Royal Lodge, reportedly funds derived from the settlement of his divorce from Sarah Ferguson, in extensive renovations to the property. That investment, his legal team argued, gave him a financial stake in the property that complicated any straightforward eviction process. And then came the point that stopped the palace cold. Forcing Andrew out of Royal Lodge, his legal representatives made clear, would require the Crown Estate to pursue formal legal action. It would require, in the most literal and public sense, the King of England to take his own brother to court over a property dispute. The palace, an institution that is simultaneously a family, a constitutional monarchy, and one of the most carefully managed public relations operations in the world, recoiled from that prospect. The optics of such a legal battle, the headlines it would generate, the questions it would raise about the personal relationships within the House of Windsor, the scrutiny it would invite about the broader financial arrangements of the royal family, all of it represented a level of institutional damage that made the cure worse than the disease. And so, throughout 2024, the pressure on Andrew continued, but without the ultimate escalation. Without the legal action that would have been required to actually remove him, Andrew stayed. And with every month that he stayed, he was communicating something to the palace, to the press, and to the watching public that no statement from his office could have conveyed with the same force. You took everything else from me. You will not take this. The standoff became, for Andrew, the last coherent act of a man whose public life has been comprehensively destroyed. The last front on which he could resist. The last place where defiance was possible. And defiance, it turns out, is remarkably cheap when you've already lost everything else. Now here is what elevates this story beyond a property dispute between two brothers. Here is what makes it genuinely significant in terms of understanding where the British monarchy is heading. Andrew, by remaining at Royal Lodge, is doing something the palace cannot tolerate, but cannot yet stop. He is visible. Windsor Great Park is not a remote estate in the Scottish Highlands, far from cameras and royal engagements. It is minutes from Windsor Castle, one of the working hearts of the modern monarchy. When the Prince and Princess of Wales visit Windsor for official engagements, when Charles holds audiences at the castle, when the full ceremonial and administrative machinery of the Crown operates on a daily basis across the Windsor estate, Andrew is there, on the same grounds, in photographs, on horseback in the Great Park, walking the estate, existing in the most stubborn and physical sense, in a place the institution has decided he no longer belongs. A man the palace has declared, in every meaningful institutional sense, a non-person, is physically, stubbornly, infuriatingly present. And sources close to Andrew make no secret of the fact that this is not accidental. His continued presence at Royal Lodge is not passive endurance. It is not simply the inertia of a disgraced man who cannot be bothered to pack up 30 rooms. It is calculated. It is deliberate. It is a strategy, however desperate, however ultimately doomed it may prove to be. His presence serves two purposes. The first is psychological. After the total demolition of his public life, after the titles, the patronages, the military affiliations, the charitable roles, the public engagements, the very identity he had constructed across 4 decades of royal service was stripped away. Royal Lodge gives Andrew something the palace cannot legislate out of existence: agency, control. A sense, however fragile, that there remains one domain in which his decisions still count, in which he still has the power to say yes or no and have that answer mean something. The second purpose is the one the palace finds most alarming. By remaining inside the Windsor estate, Andrew is keeping open just barely, just theoretically, but keeping open the possibility of rehabilitation. Palace insiders describe this belief as delusional. People who cover the royal family professionally describe it as the psychological coping mechanism of a man who cannot fully accept the permanence of his fall. But the logic, from Andrew's perspective, is not entirely irrational. As long as he is geographically inside the royal world, as long as he wakes up each morning within the boundaries of the Windsor estate, he is not definitively, irreversibly gone. He cannot be officially categorized as expelled. He occupies a liminal space, disgraceful, diminished, invisible in any official sense, but present. And presence, however uncomfortable, is not absence. The moment he leaves Royal Lodge, the moment he relocates to Frogmore Cottage, or, worse, to private accommodation entirely outside the Windsor estate, that liminal space collapses. The door closes. The last physical thread connecting Andrew to the institution that defined his entire existence is cut. Andrew is not ready for that door to close, and so he stays, and the palace waits. But there is a third dimension to this standoff that the mainstream coverage consistently underplays, and it involves a figure who has said very little publicly about the Andrew situation, but whose position on it is, according to those close to Kensington Palace, entirely unambiguous. Prince William. William is no longer simply the heir to the throne. He is, increasingly, the operational centre of gravity of the monarchy. Charles's health, though the palace manages the details with characteristic opacity, has clearly affected the pace and nature of his working schedule. The transition of institutional authority toward William is not simply a matter of constitutional succession. It is happening now, in practice, in the day-to-day management of the monarchy's reputation, its public relationships, and its long-term strategy. And William's view of Andrew is not complicated. It is not nuanced. It does not contain ambiguity or room for rehabilitation. Sources close to Kensington Palace have described William's position in terms that leave very little room for interpretation. William does not believe Andrew has any path back to royal life. He does not believe the institution can afford, reputationally, politically, or in terms of its relationship with the public, to rehabilitate the Duke of York at any point while victims of Jeffrey Epstein's network are still alive, still speaking, and still seeking justice and accountability. William is not, and has never been, Andrew's advocate inside the family. He is something else entirely. He is the institution's future. He is the man who will inherit the monarchy, and is already, in every meaningful sense, beginning to shape what that monarchy will look like. And in William's vision of the monarchy, the slimmed-down, modernized, relevance-focused institution he has spoken about publicly and privately, Andrew does not feature. Not geographically, not institutionally, not in any capacity whatsoever. The pressure on Andrew, therefore, is not simply coming from Charles's personal preference, or from the Crown Estate's administrative processes, or from the quiet manoeuvring of palace courtiers. It is coming from a direction of the next king. From a man who is younger, healthier, more politically connected within the institution, and who has a generational stake in the outcome of this standoff that Charles, for all his authority, simply cannot match. That pressure, quiet, consistent, and absolute, will only intensify as William's operational authority within the monarchy continues to grow. So how does this end? Let us be precise, because the palace will certainly not be. The most important thing to understand about the endgame of the Royal Lodge standoff is that it will not look like a confrontation. It will not look like a legal battle. It will not look like an eviction, in the dramatic bailiff and locksmith sense that word conjures. The British establishment does not, as a rule, do its most consequential work in public. It does its most consequential work through process, through administration, through the slow, grinding, legally robust machinery of institutions that have been managing difficult situations for centuries. Andrew's lease on Royal Lodge is not permanent. Leases have terms. Terms expire. Lease arrangements can be reviewed, renegotiated, and with sufficient institutional patience and legal precision, not renewed. The Crown Estate has mechanisms available to it that do not require a public confrontation between the king and his brother. They require time. They require careful legal preparation. They require the willingness to pursue a process that unfolds across months and years, rather than days and weeks. But they work. They have always worked. And they will work here. The removal of Andrew from Royal Lodge will be described, when it comes, not as an eviction, but as an administrative outcome. A lease review. A property management decision taken in the context of the Crown Estate's broader responsibilities. Language that contains no drama, no confrontation, no acknowledgement that what is being accomplished is the final, formal expulsion of the Duke of York from the royal world. And when that process concludes, and it will conclude, because all processes conclude, because leases expire and institutional patience is a form of power that Andrew cannot indefinitely resist. Andrew will leave Royal Lodge the same way he left his military titles, the same way he left his patronages, the same way he left his working royal status. Officially. Quietly. With a statement that says as little as possible, while making everything completely clear to everyone paying attention. Sarah Ferguson, who has continued to live at Royal Lodge, despite her own extraordinarily complicated relationship with the palace, will need to find alternative accommodation. The life they rebuilt together inside those 30 rooms, the life that gave both of them, in the aftermath of their respective public disasters, some semblance of structure and belonging, will be over. And when William takes the throne, the institution he inherits will not contain Andrew in any meaningful sense. Not geographically, not institutionally, not in terms of public role, public access, or public acknowledgement. Andrew will have become what the palace has been working with increasing focus and urgency to make him since 2019. A private citizen, with a title he cannot use in any official context. With a history, a permanent, unignorable, digitally preserved history that will define him long after the gates of Royal Lodge close behind him for the last time. And I want to leave you with something. Not a question about the palace politics or the lease arrangements or the legal strategy. A more fundamental question. We have spent the past several years watching an institution manage a scandal. Watching a palace handle the fallout of Andrew's association with Epstein through the tools it has always used. The quiet removal of titles, the administrative erasure of a person from official records, the slow institutional pressure that makes a situation go away without ever requiring anyone in authority to say clearly what happened, what was known, and when. The victims of Jeffrey Epstein's network of real people with real stories whose lives were shaped by what was done to them, have not received a full public accounting. Not from Epstein, who died in prison. Not from Ghislaine Maxwell, who is serving her sentence without having disclosed everything she knows. And not from the palace, which has managed this entire episode as a reputational problem to be contained rather than a human catastrophe to be confronted. So the question I want you to sit with is this. Should Andrew be allowed to quietly dissolve into private life to become the private citizen the palace is engineering him to become, without the public ever receiving a full, transparent, unfiltered account of everything the institution has chosen to handle behind closed doors? Because that is what is happening, right now, behind those iron gates, in those 30 rooms, in the administrative language of lease reviews and property management decisions. A door is closing, and once it closes, the pressure to open it again, the public, institutional, political pressure to demand accountability rather than simply accept managed disappearance, diminishes with every passing month. That is what the Royal Lodge story is really about. Not the property, not the lease, not the fraternal tension between two brothers who have never been close. It is about what accountability looks like when an institution is powerful enough to define the terms of its own scrutiny. And whether we as the public that funds this institution, that grants it its legitimacy, that waves its flags and watches its ceremonies, are willing to accept management in place of truth. Think about that, and tell me what you believe in the comments below. because the conversation happening in this community around these questions is exactly the kind of conversation the palace does not want happening at all. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so, because what is coming in the next videos goes even deeper into the fractures running through the House of Windsor. We are only getting started.